Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the Road to Resilience. My name is Jacob Picart, VP of Security Services. And on today's session, we're going to hear from security practitioners on how the cost and operational consequences of a piecemeal approach can affect your security posture. We'll look at common security frameworks and we'll look at common security frameworks that are important to higher ed and their value in strengthening security and ensuring compliance. And we'll take a look at the process and the steps that vCISOs utilize to determine relevant security frameworks, assess cybersecurity risk, identify vulnerabilities, and isolate those risks for remediation. So today I am pleased to be joined by Craig Oberlin and Kirschenman. So Craig, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. As Jacob said, my name is Craig Oberlin. I've been in higher ed off and on since 1978, so long time. I've worked in about half of my career has been in higher ed and half in the private industry. I'm currently an adjunct professor at Coastline Community College teaching cybersecurity courses. After I retired as the Chief Information Security Officer at Coast Community College District, I decided to continue giving back to higher ed by doing this type of work. I have a number of certifications across all the different frameworks and continuums, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Craig. Chris?
Yeah, I'm Chris Kirschenman. I'm the Assistant Director of Systems Development here at San Joaquin Delta College. I have probably about 16 plus years IT experience. My current role, essentially the title is not really correct for what I manage. So just to give you a flavor, I'm over the ERP, the enterprise systems that we have here, single sign-on, our cloud infrastructure, pretty much everything software-based, as well as our data center and our centralized network. We also have another assistant director that manages our client support and labs and all of the desktop support. I've also been an associate professor of computer science, and so I have, and I'm certified in AWS Solutions Architect. And yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about Delta College, if you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, sure.
So San Joaquin Delta College, you can see on the map there, we're kind of in between Central California, so by San Francisco, Sacramento are probably the biggest cities that most people would know, San Jose, of course. That does make it kind of challenging sometimes to hire tech staff because San Jose is so close and can pay so much more than higher ed can. But we serve the whole Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley County, essentially, which is that area in the middle there. Between those, Hispanic Serving Institution, have about 26,000 head count, probably about 15, 16K FTEs. As far as IT staff, and this encompasses everyone within our data center, essentially, it's about 24. It's about even, well, it's a little bit more on the desktop support, on kind of the enterprise systems and security side. We have, and cloud infrastructure side, we have about 8, I would say, of those. We do not have anyone full-time dedicated to security. That is one of the reasons for this engagement. So that's kind of laying the stage there. We do take kind of a cloud-first approach to our enterprise systems. Whenever possible, we do SaaS and then managed cloud, like our whole ERP is managed cloud and SaaS. We try to keep our data center footprint pretty light, mainly bridge systems, stuff like that. And that's important as we're talking through kind of our security needs. They're probably similar to others, but there are some things I think make it a little bit easier. And then some new challenges too, right? So where we were, just to set the stage before the Alpha G engagement, is for one thing, right around, and we'll go to the next slide to kind of show you a ransomware picture, because if you just kind of look at California there, you can see, a lot of dots around where we are, right? So within a year or so, we had like 3, 4 very close by colleges being hit by ransomware. So that really, kind of put everyone on alert here that, hey, we need to do something, The problem is, though, that we don't have a job description for a CISO, for a security officer. And we also would have challenging time, like I said, being so close to San Jose and stuff like that, even hiring for that. We also had at the same time the GLBA requirements, which I think Craig and Jacob will talk about later, requiring that. And then our California Community College system had given us some security funding. So kind of the confluence of those things made us kind of say, okay, what can we do quickly? How can we get someone on quickly to help us? We needed someone with a lot of higher ed, experience, because it's so different, dealing in higher ed security versus, let's say, the private sector security. And so we looked into about 3 different vendors. That was a purchasing requirement, and selected Apogee as our top by far. And then, yeah, so I think it's been very successful, and I'll turn back over to Jacob to talk about kind of what they
Great.
did.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And we'll circle back and we'll talk more Delta here in just a minute. But just to continue on the story with ransomware, I mean, it's no fact, and or it's a fact that cybercrime is a global problem, right? No single country is immune from being attacked. And in fact, according to the Sentinel-1 report, 54% of all global cyber attacks are targeted to the states, and higher education is within the top 3 verticals of that target. And then moving on from that, there's another report from IBM that talks about on average, higher education institutions take around 207 days to detect a breach and a further 70 days to contain it. And of course, the longer it takes to detect that attack, the higher the cost of the incident, right? And so the main attack vectors that adversaries use to access networks are vulnerabilities in software, which is why patch management is so crucial. Misconfigurations is another one, whether that's cloud or traditional infrastructure, which leads to data breaches, compromised credentials, and then, of course, phishing or a business email compromise. So 277 days in total from the time that a institution is breached until the attack is contained. And then moving on from that, we have here a few other schools that were hit last year. And so ransomware continues to be one of the primary threats facing higher ed because of the scope of the disruption it can cause and its impact. And while these schools that are popping up may have dedicated IT or security teams, they're leveraging traditional security solutions like antivirus or IDS, IPS. And ransomware actors, they're starting to leverage what we call living off the land techniques that effectively circumvent traditional signature-based detections solutions, which is why as security practitioners, we encourage the use of endpoint and extended detection, or EDR, XDR, or MDR if you bundle that into a service, because it just provides a more robust behavioral monitoring within the network. And we can get into a little bit of that a little bit later. Now, moving on, take a look at some of the ransomwares that you're seeing here. So there's CLOP and there's BN-LEAN. And if we look at this graph here, we can see the frequency of the attacks and the average payout in 2023. And note where BN-LEAN and CLOP is. They're in the top right there. So they were the most notorious or infamous ones to spread last year. Now, Lockbit, you'll notice Lockbit is the biggest one of the bunch, but Lockbit was shut down as of February of this year. So they were shut down. That was a coordinated effort to bring them down. So if you know anyone that's been impacted by Lockbit, the decryption keys have been made publicly available for anyone that's been impacted by that. But in any case, it's no surprise that it's a game of whack-a-mole, right? One ransomware strain drops, another one comes up and takes its place. So it is a cat and mouse game for sure. But with that being said, and with the sort of the cybersecurity landscape sort of set, I want to turn it to Craig to talk about how these attackers do what they do, and talk a little bit about the difference between compliance and security as we get into GLBA and stuff like that. So Craig?
Hey, Jacob, yeah, can you go back that one slide for a second? I just wanted to point out to everybody, Chris had mentioned earlier that a lot of the California community colleges had been hit ransomware over the past probably the last 2 or 3 years, especially there's a couple of them near them. If you'll notice over there in the left side, vCISO, that's one group that seemed to be specifically targeting a lot of the community colleges here in California, looking at their TTPs, their techniques, tactics, and procedures. We saw a lot of similarity looking across the different schools, and so, in fact, even CISA put out a specific announcement about them and some of the different techniques that they're using. So it's a real deal. They're out there, and once they see a group of similar type educational institutions that have similar footprints, they'll just take that technique and they just kind of move down the line. And it seemed almost to move from south to north. It was kind of ironic in there. So anyway, just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, that's a good one, Craig. I believe it was Palo Alto's Unit 42 or Cisco Talos that wrote a pretty good write-up on vCISO and how prolific they were. Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
So as everybody knows, if you're upon this, there's compliance and there's security. And we have a lot of, especially in the public sector in general and higher ed in particular, we have a lot of emphasis on compliance. We have a lot of different areas where we have to worry about complying with Title VII, things of that sort, Title V, depending upon where you are in the United States. And we're kind of culturally used to that, where with security, it's been one of those things where with the culture that we have as an organization, open access, being welcoming to students, it's historically taken a little bit of a backseat, and even compliance to some extent sometimes takes a bit of a backseat. But the reality is, if we're going to protect the institution from the attackers like that, from the threats that the ransomware and other threats that come from them, we really have to look at both compliance and we have to look at security. And it's really those two, the convergence of those two activities that allow us to help build an information security program. One of the first, go next slide, please. One of the first things from a compliance perspective, and again, California is somewhat in a unique position in that, well, I shouldn't even say that. There's a few states across the nation that are in unique positions where there isn't any real state level any kind of laws or regulations saying you must follow either the CIS controls or the NIST standards or that sort of thing. And so there are some states, Connecticut, I think, was the most recent one, where they said, if you follow the CIS controls, we sort of assume that you're doing due diligence, due care, and meeting those requirements, but it's a little bit of a get out of jail free card, but it isn't a hard requirement to do it. And so it's made it easier from a compliance perspective and historically to say, well, we're secure. I mean, I remember having a conversation with the CFO back over a decade ago, thankfully, at one of the colleges, saying, we're a school, why would they want to attack us? I think that time has long since gone. And of course, with the ransomware and the impact of that, that's no longer even an issue. But then the end of 2023, the FTC, after some long dialoguing going on within, I think, the Department of Ed and the FTC, came out with some GLBA requirements that apply to schools that offer federal financial aid, and in some cases, state financial aid. And these came out, and I think all of us are probably very familiar with them, these 9 safeguard rules that came out. I think it's important to understand that these are preliminary, or what I would call very early stages, through various dear colleague letters. The Department of Education has said, we will give you more guidance on other NIST standards like SB 800-171 that you'll probably have to follow. I was involved in the discussions early on back in 2016 with them, and they were really moving quickly towards that. And I think through successful lobbying, both by EDUCAUSE and by other organizations, we were able to get some time in between the two. But the reality is, we are starting to see organizations like San Joaquin Delta and others that are getting audited as part of their annual federal financial aid to look at these GLBA requirements. And there's some important ones in here. Some of them are things that maybe, but there's probably nothing in here that we shouldn't have been doing in the past. But now there's some specific articulated goals that both empower the IT staff and the IT security teams to do a little bit more than maybe what we've historically been doing, and also to get us more secure. You have to have a designated qualified individual. You have to have somebody who's qualified. You can't just say, well, that network administrator over there is now the person who's responsible for the information program. There are some ways of not getting around that, of facilitating outside help, but you still have to have an individual who is an employee of the institution who oversees that person if they're using an outside vCISO is the case in there.
Yeah.
We also have to have a written information security plan based upon a risk assessment. So we have to have a plan, we have to have a program, and it has to be done on a full risk assessment. Obviously, we have to have safeguards that identify and put controls in place to mitigate those risks. You need to continue monitoring the effectiveness of those controls. There's an actual and articulated now requirement for providing staff with training. And that's one of the big differences between compliance and security, because while the requirements often will say you have to provide staff with training, they don't articulate the specifics of what the curriculum should be. And that's where it can come into play, where higher ed, since GLBA was really designed for banks, higher ed has a higher requirement for, because of the types of information we deal with, and because we deal with students and that sort of the populations we deal with, we can really craft that in a more specific manner. And then you need to, service provider has become a bigger deal actually after SolarWinds and those types of activities. And then you have to do a review, and you have to have an incident response plan that's written, and you have to be able to, on a no less than an annual basis, provide a report to your board of directors. So from a requirements perspective, from a compliance perspective, this is the primary compliance requirements that we have across the board, along with PCI and some other activities. From a security, next slide, from a security perspective, that addresses part of the equation, but the reality is the bad guys we have to protect ourselves from the bad guys and the threat actors. And the threat actors have a mechanism or a process that they generally follow. This is the cybersecurity kill chain made popular by Lockheed Martin. And there's a steps in there where they basically do reconnaissance, go through creating an exploit or using one, deliver it, deliver the exploitation, install it, and then set up some command and control so that they can continue to do whatever their plan for, whether it's exfiltrating data, ransomware, changing grades, any of that sort of activity. So it's a pretty standard process, fairly high level. Then what's come around on the next slide is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where you look at each of these areas, and the columns are a little bit more granular view of that kill chain. And there's a lot of specific ways that the threat actors can do it. You can see each of those blockings, those blocks and rectangles show different ways of them achieving those goals in each of those steps. And that's where it's important to look at your organization, understand what you're either, in the case of specific threat actors that are targeting you, which ones they're actually using, which ones you're more susceptible to. Credential dumping is one we see a lot happening within higher ed because of reuse of passwords by students. And then you can target which controls from either a compliance framework or just a set of controls and standards that you want to apply in order to meet those specific threats and risks that your organization is facing. And in order to do that, you would do a security risk assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Yeah, and so with that being said, we talked about the current security landscape, some of the threats that are out there. We talked a little bit about compliance and how these attackers are penetrating and getting through networks. And so now we talk about the SRA, what we call the SRA, or the security risk assessment. Basically, how do we conduct these assessments? What's involved? How long does it take? What are some of the processes and tools, or TTPs, as I like to call them, that we go through in order to conduct these SRAs? So real quick, in short, a security risk assessment is broken up into 5 phases. And the way that we go about them is, the first phase is discovery. So this is where we are reviewing any existing documentation that you may have, taking a look at network diagrams, application topologies, data flows, things of that nature. It's the mapping and discovery phase. And then the second phase is when we get into the identify phase. And so here we usually conduct a vulnerability scan against the environment. Both an external and an internal can be facilitated. And we also take a look at physical access controls, because there is no network security without physical security, right? And so understanding what your network closets are look like, and whether they're secure, and making sure that you don't have a server that's publicly accessible or something like that in the environment. It's important to identify that and highlight that. And then in the third phase, we get into the analyzing specifically the risk and the impacts of those risks. So after the scans are conducted, after all the relevant information is analyzed, we take the risk, we evaluate them against several factors such as ease of exploitation or prevalence or any historical incidents that may have impacted the college or the school. And then that is followed then by phase 4, which is the assess phase. And then in the assess phase, we are calculating and we're prioritizing the risk. So we build out a matrix, and that helps to classify each risk scenario and the university's risk tolerance. And we assign particular actions to those, whether to avoid or accept the risk, whether to mitigate the risk, or whether to transfer the risk. And then finally, the 5th phase is the documentation phase. So in this phase here, we are compiling and presenting. So we compile our report, we identify the owners, the risk level, the mitigation plan. We put together an executive presentation that can be socialized and shared with the board or with management. And we also put together a remediation plan in order to address all of those risks. And this slide here, the next slide here, just shows you a sample of what that work product looks like. So you'll see that it's not a dry spreadsheet or a dry document. There's a lot of graphics and visuals that help to illustrate what the potential environment looks like, where those risks are, and how best to address those moving forward. And so some of the TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures that we use for our SRA is we have an onboarding questionnaire, and we have an in-house tool that we use to do that. We also conduct a risk-based assessment, and that's dependent on the framework. So Craig talked a little bit earlier about GLBA and NIST and CIS. So those different types of framework can be incorporated into the assessment. We do an in-depth review, and we discuss all the framework control families. We conduct those vulnerability scans, like I mentioned earlier, and we import it all into this platform. And this basically allows us to quickly compile everything we know about the university's cybersecurity defense. The stakeholders involved will learn what they don't know and what they do know, and be introduced to cybersecurity gaps that they need to know. We'll identify vulnerabilities that can be easily attacked, and it provides a threat-based priority list. And if I zoom in here to give you a better view of what this dashboard looks like, again, this is our tool that we use for our vCISO engagements. And so here, let me use the laser pointer here. You can see here that this Venn diagram here has all the different control families that will be assessed during the engagement. And we go through the questionnaire, and then we find out where we stand insofar as that framework. And so the light gray, kind of hard to see, but the light gray here is where you should be in order to be compliant. And then the blue here depicts where you basically scored, or where you landed in that compliance, so that we can then focus our efforts to all these different areas here that are not meeting the target or are under. We can focus our efforts and make sure that we shore those up. So this is just an example of what the platform looks like when we engage. There's a posture score here that 7. This is just an example with 7.2 out of 10. Basically, this here, the attacker's view, those vulnerability scans that we conduct, again, both external and internal. You'll see those here. If you click on this, you get a list of all the IPs that were scanned and all the different vulnerabilities that were found, and on a high, medium, low type of rating. And then we have our tasks that will be generated based off the assessment, so that we can then essentially assign resources and help to remediate those gaps. And so that is just a quick overview of our platform that we use. Now, moving on to the vulnerability scan, for those who aren't aware, it's basically a 5-step process. So in step 1, we're identifying and determining the scope of the scan. And that includes network IP ranges, the assets that need to be scanned. In steps 2 and 3, we're utilizing scanning tools to discover those devices. and the services and protocols that are running within the environment. We identify any active host, any open ports, any running services. All this involves utilizing vulnerability databases, security advisories, and known exploit databases to match identified services against known vulnerabilities. And then finally, in steps 4 and 5, we're analyzing those results. We're assessing the severity and the potential impact of those vulnerabilities. And then we're generating a report to outline the findings of those scans. And again, all of that is packaged into the security risk assessment that we do. And if you're wondering, well, how long does this take? Well, typically what we see is an engagement to conduct the risk assessment itself is anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks. Oftentimes it could be as much as 8 weeks, just depends on the involvement from the school. But there on the left there, you'll see those are all the different phases that I mentioned earlier. If you recall, there's 5 phases to the SRA. And so those are the different phases. And this is typically what we see when we're conducting these engagements. And so at the end of the risk assessment, basically we have that report that I mentioned that we compile. We have the executive presentation, and we have our findings, and we present that and share that with you. Now, there may be cases where that's great, Jacob. I'm glad that you're able to generate that report and show us where our gaps are, but we don't have the security leadership to action on what you just shared, or we need help to action on what you've just found. And so that's where we then pivot then specifically to our vCISO services. And that's the sort of the engagement that we've been engaged with Delta on, and we'll talk a little bit more here with Chris about some of the work that we've been doing there in order to help them with their security posture. So, you know, every higher education can benefit from a vCISO because we help to understand the goals and the risks. We help to create cybersecurity strategy. We help to assess those cybersecurity gaps. We can understand any strategic vulnerabilities. We can help to implement remediation plans. We can help to oversee that compliance process, and we can help to report to the board. So a vCISO resource is a strategic resource. It's not a tactical hands-on resource. It's a strategic resource that can help you and your team in order to address and shore up your cybersecurity and compliance gaps. And so with that, some of these cybersecurity controls that we implement, I mean, cybersecurity insurance is becoming more and more dependent upon some of these controls that you see on the screen, right? We can expect more rigorous and detailed questions from underwriters, and we can ensure that the respective security controls here are in place. You know, we're a big fan of managed detection and response, like I mentioned earlier, to help catch nefarious actions on the network in real time and be able to isolate and stop that. They're depicted as a managed detect and response. Of course, multi-factor authentication is something that we encourage and advocate for our customers to do. Me being a former cloud architect, immutable backups and leveraging the cloud in order to keep basically an air gap or an isolated copy of your backups, so that in the event that ransomware gets through your defenses, you have the ability to restore from your backups that haven't been impacted. So these are all some of the things that we advocate for, and we help our customers implement in their environments. And so lastly, before we come back to Chris and talk more about Delta, with the vCISO services, you know, colleges are going to gain immediate access to security expertise, helping to close those security gaps and assist with both the strategic and the remediation support. Like I mentioned before, we will help to meet compliance requirements, identify those gaps, and develop a plan to manage and close them. We meet with stakeholders to engage on cybersecurity priorities and those strategies, and to assist with the resolution of those remediation tasks. And of course, we, like Craig mentioned earlier, we help to draft incident response plans as well as information security plans. So at this point, we'll bring Chris back in, and we'll talk Delta, and we'll talk a little bit more about vCISO. So Chris, tell us, what are some of the challenges that Delta has been having?
Yeah, definitely. So as I was kind of mentioning earlier, you know, again, we were seeing the writing on the wall, all the ransomware attacks around us. Also, like I said, it's extremely challenging for us to hire, you know, very skilled, especially security personnel. So that's why we
Yeah.
were excited to be able to get this going, and it was a really quick engagement. The risk assessment really helped us kind of narrow in on kind of what those things were that we really needed to focus on. But just as exciting for me, as well as kind of getting those and kind of helping us prioritizing, is also kind of working through, kind of like I said before, we have kind of a cloud first strategy. But that doesn't, eliminate the security requirements just because we're going with SaaS, right? It actually changes how the engagement is, because then we really need to evaluate these vendors very well and make sure that their security aligns with our security requirements, right? But coming in, we had no incident response plan. We had no infrastructure plan. We were pretty much running the business. That's all we had time for. But through this engagement, we've been able to have all of those, and made a bunch of different other improvements to that. So.
Great, great, yeah. Well, how has engaging with Apogee enhanced the overall security posture? I mean, I know there's been work that we've been doing with MDR and managed firewall and things of that nature. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is one of the big challenges we had is security is really a 24/7 type of thing where you can get attacked at any time. In fact, you're more likely to get attacked in off hours, right?
Yeah,
Um, so so that was one of the first things that I brought up after the risk assessment, is how do we get to that 24/7 monitoring, and what should we do there? And this engagement, this vCISO engagement, was really critical in helping us understand kind of what our needs were, and then selecting a vendor that could help us figure out a AI-driven approach that was 24/7, that could really narrow us in on actionable things, the things that were really important, as opposed to just a bunch of noise, which is, one of the problems you get, right? It's the more data you
yeah,
bring in, the more potential noise you have. That if it's not, if you're getting too much noise, you're not going to be able to, it's worse than having no information at all, right? So, but and this was going through a process because, again, our purchasing department is very rigorous about, they want to make sure that we've looked at multiple vendors and that we have we've really done our homework there, and it really helped with that. The managed firewall as well was something that we had in a potential engagement that we were working through, but just really taking advantage of that. This vCISO has really made us help understand what we've had there from a security standpoint, like getting access to those logs and stuff like that. So I would say those two things are definitely very critical.
yeah, yeah. Agreed, agreed. What about any cybersecurity improvements that Delta has benefited from, specifically by working with us and the Apogee team?
Yeah, for sure. So, and I think, again, when we're thinking about this, again, I don't have, we don't have staff that are dedicated to security. So being
Yeah,
able to prioritize the tasks that we do need to do is so critical. And I've really been, it's really helped us kind of narrow in on those things that we need to do, as well as having the vCISO engagement, that can report up to the VP and the higher leadership, helps us really justify. It's like, okay, well, if we do need to halt on one project in order to address our security needs, it's
yeah,
been really, really beneficial to have this engagement that actually has, been able to create documents that shows that, we have a plan, and this is why it's so important for us to make these security changes, right? That was definitely a gap before, and so it was a lot harder for me to make that justification to my higher leadership, that security was important, and it was more, it's important. It's kind of the foundation, and if you don't get your security right, it doesn't matter what software you bring on. It's just not,
yeah, yeah.
you have the potential for disruption. You have a potential for hugely embarrassing, or hugely impactful ransomware attack, or data breach, or any of those things. But
Agreed.
communicate that up has been really beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention is how often we meet with our customers in a vCISO. And so we meet weekly, right, Chris? We speak almost every week, if not through our calls. We're collaborating through Teams channels or through emails or what have you. So we are very much an extension of your team in order to make sure that we are helping to shore up the cybersecurity posture of the school. Um, so with
Hey,
that
Jacob,
being,
go ahead.
yeah,
No,
yeah, go ahead.
I
I
was
was,
going to just remind everybody, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A
mm,
button down at the bottom of your screens for questions. We'll have a chance where you can ask questions that Jacob, myself, or Chris also is just coming up here shortly. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. Chris, how about any cost savings or efficiency gains realized by our partnership, such as reduced incident response times or more effective resource allocation?
I,
Basically, freeing you guys up, right?
Absolutely. I think the resource, more efficient resource allocation is definitely a big one. And it kind of comes back to that prioritizing and figuring out what those highest impact security related tasks that we need to do are. But then it's also been really beneficial to have you guys help us identify both internal and external, right? So it's like you're identifying these and saying, okay, well, can your staff handle this? And if not, can we find some help, right, to take care of that? I would also say, so we get a lot of one-time security money. We don't get a lot of ongoing, but again, this engagement has been critical for helping us uh, uh, allocate that one-time security money in the most impactful way. So I'd say that's been a huge advantage too, and really a good cost of, enhancement there.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Agreed.
One clarification real quick for everybody. Use the Q&A button at the bottom, not the chat feature. In a webinar format, the chat feature is disabled, but the Q&A button will work for everybody, for those of you who are having challenges.
Thanks, Craig. And I guess, Chris, lastly, and I remember this when we first started the engagement, and this has to do with the auditors, but how has Apogee supported Delta's compliance efforts with regulations such as GLBA? I remember this fondly because literally within weeks of starting the vCISO engagement with Delta, I remember the auditors were knocking at your guys' door.
Absolutely, and that was one of the reasons that we wanted to move very quickly on this engagement too, right? Is because I unfortunately, again, not having a vCISO or a regular CISO, I should say, we didn't have anyone who was allocated to this, right? So we have staff that are doing their day-to-day, run the business, and no one directly engaged in this. And plus, it was a new thing for us, right? We're trying to learn what to do about it, right? At the same time that we're trying to respond. So that was definitely very, very helpful to have. And then again, I would also, point out the again, that kind of looking at our new contracts, our new software that's coming in and helping us figure out kind of a plan, making sure those are secured, giving us a ability to push back in a way that's, again, relatable to the higher ups. Because it can be hard to push back on things for security related reasons. But I'd say this engagement has really kind of highlighted why it's so important. So.
Yeah, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. Thanks, Chris. Craig, did you have anything before we hop into the Q&A?
No, I think we can go ahead and jump in. We have a couple of questions. The first one we'll talk about is I hear that GLBA and FTC safeguards sometimes are used interchangeably. What's the difference? And I can jump on that. So GLBA is short for Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and that's the law that was passed, almost 15, maybe more than 15, 20 years ago, about regulating financial institutions, really targeting banks primarily in terms of their requirements around cybersecurity and security in general, protecting customer information. So GLBA is that sort of, you want that giant umbrella. And the FTC, because it's part of that law, became the governing agency around those types of activities. What has happened over the past year and a half now is the FTC has said all banks have to follow these, what they call these safeguard rules. They're now starting to actually specifically enumerate specific requirements that I covered earlier. And those are the ones that we have to follow. And because of, well, and those ones we have to follow. Now, back around 2016, well, even early that 2010, I think it was the first one, the Department of Education had ruled that the Federal Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education had ruled because we offer financial aid, we are considered a bank, if you like, and GLBA does apply. And so that's what sets the precedence how GLBA applies to higher ed, and how the FTC gets involved. But we also have the Department of Ed over here who has the opportunity to enforce other requirements in addition to that. From an enforcement perspective, we have these safeguard rules that came from the FTC, and we're probably going to see, in my view, more information coming from the Department of Ed around having to follow NIST 800-171 as soon as the Rev 3 is finalized. It went through the final public discussion and finished that in late January, and they have targeted or indicated that they want to have it published by spring of this year, spring of 2024. So we're getting close to spring being gone. So we could end up with a set of federal regulations from the FTC and from the Department of Ed. Right now, we have the safeguard rules, which gets used often as calling GLBA, because it's falling under the GLBA, the Grammar Beach Bliley Act law. Yeah. Another question we had, anything you want to add to that, Jacob?
No, it's good.
Okay. Another question was, it was a question around the standard used for pen testing and our approach. Now, before I hand that one off to Jacob from an Apogee broader perspective, we did not do pen testing in the case for Delta College because they already had pen testing. One of the services that the state chancellor's office provided is annual pen testing to each of the colleges. So in the case of our assessment, we ended up using what was already available to us. We do need to do annual pen testing. The GLBA safeguards require annual pen testing, no less than annual pen testing. So that will be coming up. We end up due again for that. And then we'll work with Chris and the team, and we'll figure out whether we want to continue using the state version or look at other approaches for doing that as well. Part of that question, Jacob, that I'm going to hand off to you is the approach we use. The questioner had asked, said that there was no standard for pen testing. There are actually two sort of pseudo standards out there: the PTS, the Pen Testing Execution Standard, and the OSSTMM, which I don't think is maintained as well, but my recollection serves. And then there's OWASP, has a set of sort of guidelines specifically for web application pen testing. So there are some standards out there. If you want to look and Google it, you can see what it is. The PTS is one that I hear about used more often than not. I also know that a lot of the pen test organizations that are out there that do pen testing often have their own playbooks and their own rule books and standards and processes they follow through their experience, and they get tailored based upon obviously the customer engagement and what the needs are, the requirement, and how long they have, and that sort of thing. Maybe you can give a general answer, Jacob. I know you've been looking at standardizing some of that process.
Right. Yeah. So our approach to pen testing is it's an add-on to the vCISO engagement, and we leverage service delivery partners to execute that. Because as vCISOs, we have pretty intimate knowledge of your guys' environment, right? And so we want to know, well, what's a third party going to look without any of the relevant tribal knowledge, right, of the school. And so hence we leverage STPs to conduct those pen tests. And like Craig mentioned, those I guess methodology, you can call it, follow either if it's web applications that you need tested, it will follow OWASP. If it's a traditional pen test, the PTS will be followed. Basically, their approach is, give me an IP address and we can see if we can hack into it. And this is, of course, an external IP. And so they're pretty good team. I myself am a former ethical hacker, so I know some of the tools and the techniques that they use in order to conduct those tests, and it is very thorough.
So you're not an unethical hacker now. You're still.
Yeah, right. All right. Are there any more questions in the Q&A?
No, just please,
No?
if you have any
Okay.
questions, please type them in the Q&A. The recording, this is being recorded. The recording will be made available afterwards.
Yeah.
And also we will, if we don't have a chance, if you have any other questions, you'll have the opportunity to do that, and we'll be able to answer those as well. But if you do have any questions, please go ahead and type them in. We'd be happy to. For Chris, a lot of you want to talk and hear what Chris's experience has been, maybe, or Jacob or me.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Chris. Really appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to join us today to go through and just geek out on cybersecurity.
We do have one other question, real quick,
one other
if we have
question
time.
came in?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
great.
just coming. Actually, a couple of them. Let's do this one. The vulnerability scan procedures you mentioned earlier seem very common in the security world. Is there any specific way that they're different from others?
Oh, let me go back to that slide. You're talking about the vuln scan procedure here. This is the standard that is used specifically, especially when it's coming from the outside. So we'll get the list of IPs, we'll scan it, we'll scan those IPs against the vulnerability database that we have. And then, of course, like I mentioned, we ingest it into our platform. For an internal tests are done a little bit differently. Typically, what you have is you'll have a vendor that will want to deploy an appliance or something like that. Our internal vuln scans are run differently. We use a PowerShell script to execute that, and the PowerShell script runs on the environment, and then it zips up the data, and when we import it into our platform so that we can then visualize and see what we're looking at insofar as vulns. But this is the process that we would follow in order to conduct those scans.
Yeah, I think building on that a little bit too, the vulnerability scan procedure is probably like this, but there's the whole vulnerability management program, and those have to be tailored often to the specific schools based upon the systems they're running and the priorities and that sort of activity. Everybody's usually pretty good about running vulnerability scans. Again, another nice feature that the state of California provides each of the schools is a NIST scanner, so a license for NIST scanning and doing the vulnerability scan. So many of the colleges we've worked with are making use of that service. Where the challenge comes is, a lot of the systems that the schools use, they're not designed for multi-cloud. They're not cloud-based. They're not designed to have. They're kind of old monolithic systems that have to have downtime. And there's never a good time to take a system down. It seems like in the old days, students didn't work at class at 2:00 in the morning. Now with Canvas and a lot of it LMS and real-time distance ed, there's never a good time. Registration seems to be always going on, and so prioritizing, doing the prioritization, the categorization, using things like the known exploit vulnerability catalog, the KEV from CISA. Looking at the criticality from the vendors, looking at what's going on in the environment. Are we actually seeing, looking at logs, and are we actually seeing attempted exploits on specific ones? Helps us prioritize that so that we can then either try to exploit it, and in some cases, as Chris can attest to, we can't completely, there aren't a patch available, or we don't have the ability to do it. So then we have to work together with them to come up with mitigation steps, compensating controls in the vernacular, to find a way to mitigate the risk that way. And that's very much a case-by-case basis and a school-by-school basis as well. And we've had to do that work with Chris and his team to find ways to say, okay, we can't do this right now. What can we do in the interim until we can to mitigate that risk?
And let me add to that too, because I think this is a big differentiator too versus the other kind of vulnerability scans we've had from people with no or very limited higher ed experience, is going through this platform with the experts that really understand higher education needs. Because if you're going to do something that impacts faculty, that you need someone who understands that and understands how we can do that and how we can deal with that when it comes to impacting faculty, impacting students, kind of understanding when they work. And understanding, kind of our boards and how that all works too has been really that combination of the platform as well as the real experts on security and higher ed, so that's a big differentiation there.
Yeah, and just slightly building on that too, Chris, I think, California is somewhat unique in terms of its governance structure with what they call participatory governance. And so having to understand navigating the governance for those types of, for California community colleges in particular, to get either technical changes made or governance types, sort of administrative controls. You have to tailor to the organization. You have boards, you have committees, you have faculty representation. Sometimes in some cases, you even have student representation that you need to go through that has to be tailored for each organization, depending upon, the nature of their governance structure.
Yeah.
How do you get faculty to cooperate with your vulnerability scan? An example. Anybody want to offer that one of those up?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, we're working with IT in order to conduct these scans and with management. I mean, we typically have stakeholder buy-in in order to conduct these scans. So we typically don't have pushback on conducting a scan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think maybe getting past the scan parts, as you said, we don't really have a resistance. Half the time, they don't even know what's going on.
Yeah.
The scans are just done off hours or other time. It's the question of what you do with the results.
Afterwards,
And I think yeah, and I think it depends on what the nature of the vulnerability you're trying, the steps you're taking to mitigate that vulnerability.
Yeah.
If it's scheduling, if it requires a full system down, all the way down to changing maybe a way faculty, maybe they don't have local admin, maybe they don't get some of the freedoms that they're used to having in the past. And I think it becomes very much a case by case basis. I can tell you they asked for an example. So one situation that I did it when I was actually at the Coast District as a CISO, when we were rolling out MFA back in 2017, is I had to meet with each of the constituent groups. So I met with the technology committees, I met with the academic senate group, and I explained to them the impact of what MFA was designed to do, the impact of, and this was before it became a requirement, which makes it a little bit easier. But I did it. What's the impact to instruction if they don't have that ability? What's the impact to the students? What's the both positive and negative? What's the impact to employees and protecting their information? And really tried to explain it in a very logical fashion about why we're doing it. It's not some arbitrary, rule we decided to throw in.
Yeah.
And I got very little feedback, at all, negative feedback. And the only, the question I had from faculty in particular was, what about students who don't have maybe a cell phone to do an MFA on? And we came up with some compensating ways around that for those students. It varies. Now we come back and we have the discussion with them and say, this is what we have to do. It's a compliance issue, just like the other compliance issues we're familiar with. And if we don't comply, although I think it's probably, hopefully unlikely, but potentially the institution could lose the opportunity to give federal financial aid. And, that's not good for students. That's not good for the school. That's not good for anybody. And so I think, MFA in particular is one of those ones that over time, now it's like students expect it. There are still some schools that are still struggling with it, and there's the students are coming back saying, why don't we have MFA? I have it on my bank account or my Robinhood account or my other account that I'm using all the time, my Facebook account, my Instagram account, and so they're really asking the schools why they don't have it. So I think it's you deal with it a very you have to talk. It's communication. It's all about communication.
Yeah.
I know, Chris, if you have, or Jacob, if you have, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just agree 100%. I mean, I just go back to this IBM report, right? Vulnerabilities, right? You have to patch your software. You have to patch your appliances. I just keep thinking of last summer, we had the Move It vulnerability that impacted a lot of higher ed. Just yesterday was Patch Tuesday, where Microsoft released almost 200 different patches to address CVEs. Just a few weeks ago, the Avanti VPN appliances have been impacted, and they've been finding zero-day exploits. I mean, it's critically important to patch your infrastructure and to patch your systems to keep these attackers out. And so I'm a big evangelist or proponent for patching and just scheduling the patching, right? I mean, weigh the pros and cons. You don't want to be impacted by a ransomware event or anything like that.
And Chris mentioned it earlier about, they've taken a cloud first,
Yeah.
SaaS model for a lot of where the crown jewels are, the ERP
Exactly.
system.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that makes some of that a little bit easier, candidly. It transfers at least the responsibility, if not the accountability with it. And they can go back and rely on the vendor to, hey, make sure the software is patched and our data is protected. And of
Exactly.
course, as part of the safeguards and the requirement to do supplier, is they have contracts, and if they didn't have contracts to start with, is part of every renewal cycle, there's new verbiage we're adding in that will, using the issue of the HVAC early on in terms of talking to new vendors, or just make sure there's verbiage from legal counsel to make sure that the supply chain is at least contractually secure, if not technically secure as well.
Yeah, agreed.
I know we're almost at the top of the hour. I think that's most of the questions that have come in.
Okay.
There was one other question, just hearing how Chris worked with other campus stakeholders. Chris, maybe you can talk about other stakeholders responding to the SRA recommendations. If you're ever at that point, have you had to? I know we did it some time ago. We've been in spring and fall semester. Any feedback you want to give on that in terms of your specific experiences at Delta with dealing with the constituent groups?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things is trying to find ways to minimize the impact, to make things as easy as possible for them. Like when we rolled out the faculty MFA, we use the Okta platform here. And so we found ways to make it more of an adaptive, so we're still requiring MFA when it's required, but not every single time, right? And so not overly burning. And I think just communicating that to them, that, this is a partnership here, right? There's a give and take. You're helping with our security,
Right.
convincing them that you're part of the solution here. You can help us make sure we don't have these really impactful ransomware or data breaches and stuff like that. So that's what I would add there.
Perfect. Yep,
Yeah.
agreed. That's it,
Well,
Jacob.
great. That's it. All right. Well, again, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Craig, for hopping on and geeking out again on cybersecurity. And thanks for everyone for joining. And we'll give you back a few minutes of your time.